Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Hamas Contained by Tareq Baconi. And you can see the subtitle of this book is The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. And right away we can see the book title, at least the subtitle, has not aged well. The book was published in 2018. It is now 2025. Does anybody think that Hamas is contained or pacified? No, but I can see how the author might have thought that at that time to some extent. And we're going to get there in our review today. But in the beginning, let's just talk about what is Hamas in the first place. First of all, what does Hamas even stand for? It's Harakat al-Mukawama al-Islamiyya. And the Arabic speakers, please forgive my poor pronunciation there. But each of those letters, Harakat, H, al, A, Mukawama, that's the M, A, al, Islamiyya, so the A, and then they put the S in there. And effectively, this is the Islamic resistance movement. But it also means zeal. So if you're wondering what Hamas stands for, that's what it stands for. It's Arabic. How did Hamas start? You have to realize it doesn't start as Hamas. It starts as a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a branch of it working in Palestine. Fortunes started shifting for the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian territories, with an increase in financial remittances from the Palestinian diaspora community, as well as from sister Islamic organizations in the Arab Gulf states and in Jordan. Funds were also collected domestically through Islamic almsgiving. As the Brotherhood enjoyed this financial upturn, it began investing in civil institutions that could strengthen and expand its mission of social regeneration, including mosques, schools, clinics, and youth clubs. So you can see it starts, the Muslim Brotherhood in this particular instance, as a charitable wing, collecting money and using it for schools, clinics, youth clubs, and mosques. So this is how Hamas began, as a part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, things develop, obviously, and Sheikh Yassin, who is one of the founders of Hamas, implemented a strict hierarchical structure within the Islamic Association that created a great deal of frustration from within its own member base, particularly among the younger generation. Largely driven by such frustrations, a splinter organization called Islamic Jihad broke off in 1981. Islamic Jihad emerged as the antithesis of the Brotherhood, calling for immediate jihad against the Israeli occupation. So right away, quite early on, you can see that Hamas was considered moderate in relation to Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad, obviously with young, idealistic young men, we must carry the fight to the infidel now. And they were not interested in, I would say, this slower path of the Islamic Association, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of we're going to make sure we build up religion within our people, and over time things may change. Ideologically, Islamic Jihad saw the liberation of Palestine as the path toward the revival of the Islamic nation, effectively reversing the Brotherhood's order of priorities. For Islamic Jihad, blind dedication to Islamization compromised the Palestinian struggle. In contrast to the Brotherhood's pragmatic engagement with Israel, Islamic Jihad remained categorical in its rejection of dealings with Israel and focused on confronting the occupation, rather than on building Islamic institutions to serve the longer-term battle. So even here, early 80s, before it's even called Hamas, you can see there is a lot of pragmatism that runs through Hamas, that they're not going to say, this is our principle and we can't bend, we can't be flexible. And Islamic Jihad, which still exists to this day, saw that fairly early on and broke away. You see the solution here to the Brotherhood's pragmatic engagement with Israel. People don't know this, but Israel helped to fund Hamas in the early days, not only by opening corridors in which money could flow in through different financial structures, or even literally coming into Gaza in briefcases, but I think they also funded Hamas themselves with their own money. Remember that this was done at the time of the partition resolution as well, that Israel would fund other Palestinian nationalist organizations that did not like the Grand Mufti. So that would appear to have a splintered Palestinian nation. And the Jews funded that during that time. So when we talk about pragmatic engagement with Israel, that's what we mean. Now that Arafat had given up on the vision of liberating all of Palestine, so this would be post-Oslo, and dismantling the Zionist state, Hamas rose to articulate an alternative path for liberation. Jihad was defined not as a tactic, but rather as a holistic strategy around which the Palestinian community could rally. And we'll talk about Oslo, I hope, in a future review. I'm still continuing to do the research to make sure that I have a coherent understanding of what happened in Oslo. But I have a generally pretty good view. But post Oslo, it's harder to maintain a united Palestinian front because you have these two different wings: negotiation and resistance. And Hamas comes over time to typify the sense of resistance, and the PA, a child of Oslo and of the PLO, tends to represent negotiation. Obviously, you need both. You need both negotiation and resistance, but Israel has done a very good job of splitting that, wittingly or no, that has happened. As the fighter Izz al-Din al-Qassam had done more than half a century prior, Hamas extended religious legitimacy to its military tactics, in this case to suicide bombings, and increased their permissibility among Palestinians. Rather than referring to these attacks as suicidal, which is sinful in Islam, Hamas called them martyrdom operations and celebrated them as heroic self-sacrifice. So I should take a pause here for a moment to point out Christianity, like Islam, I'd like to use the phrase looks dimly on, but condemns suicide would probably be better here. And it is not universally accepted within Islam that suicide bombing is not suicide, that it is heroic self-sacrifice. And I cannot think of any scenario that I could ever support suicide bombing. And it is a show of how desperate the situation is that Hamas could find a way to theologically justify suicide. But it is that example of people feeling like they've got no hope and no other way to do something great for their people that they would do this. In some sense, I understand it, but there is no way that I could ever support it or applaud it. Suicide bombing is not just a crime against the people that you kill. It's a crime against yourself, and it's a crime against God. And it's unfortunate. It seems that there are fewer suicide bombers these days in Hamas's tactics, but at this time it was part of what was the growth of Hamas, and it's unfortunate that this happened. Hamas's glorification of suicide bombing fostered an environment where they were highly regarded actions, ensuring both the supply of volunteers and the enhanced execution of operations. I have to keep in mind those volunteers were thinking, I'm going to get to provide for my family for the rest of my life, because if I'm a martyr, Hamas will make sure that my family gets payments forever. And they saw this as, in a sense, working for their family. And as I say, I understand where they're coming from. I cannot approve of their actions, but it'd be silly to say I don't understand where they're coming from. Before long, these tactics were adopted by non-Islamic movements, including Fatah, the main party in the PLO, which had ostensibly renounced terrorism in 1988. Hamas publications claim that attackers were left unidentified for fear of reprisal. Articles often embellish the ferocity of these operations, while accusing Israel of underreporting their impact to quell the Israeli public's panic. There was also a constant promise of future escalation. In an interview with Sheikh Yassin, the leader stressed, "The Intifada will evolve into militarized resistance, and al-Qassam's revenge is only a matter of time." By the end of 2000, al-Qassam released its first leaflet to the people in Gaza glorifying the martyrs of our righteous people who have faced with their bare chests and stones the oppression and terror of the sons of pigs and apes. Now, al-Qassam is the military wing of Hamas. This is something else that we have to parse, that when people say, do you condemn Hamas? This is the sort of joke Piers Morgan question. When anyone asks you this, that they're not serious. This is a person who you should not engage with. Because Hamas is not just one thing. There is the governmental side, that the people who govern Gaza. This would be teachers, policemen, mailmen, firefighters. These people are paid by Hamas. And then there is the military wing of Hamas that carries out resistance operations. These two are under the same banner, but they don't report to each other. And in fact, we know that Hania in Qatar did not know that Yahya Sinwar had planned an attack because they don't coordinate with each other. They somewhat follow each other's leads, but they don't ask each other for permission to do things. As far as the book puts forth, and I think you'll learn that as you read this and you learn more about Hamas. But the point is, when someone says, "Do you condemn Hamas?" Are you saying, "Do you want me to condemn school teachers that are paid by Hamas? Do you want me to condemn mailmen that are paid by?" Because there's a far more of those people than there are the military wing of Hamas. When we're thinking about the numbers and who helps whom, this image of facing death with their bare chests, it's a very evocative image, and it's something that you'll hear and read about in Hezbollah literature as well. And it's very, not only am I not afraid of death, I'm going to unbutton my shirt and I'm going to show you my bare chest to show you. And that is extremely, I have to say, in the natural order, it's very admirable in the sense of not fearing death. The death is not the greatest thing that can happen to me. In a sense, death, not serving my country, not serving my God, that would be a great harm. But death in this life, that is nothing. And I would tend to associate myself with that's true. That this life is passing, and what matters is where our life is oriented and where we are pointing towards when we die. On May the 18th, 2001, less than 2 months after its first operation, Hamas carried out a second suicide mission in Netanya. Elaborating on the philosophical premise underlying the balance of terror, Hamas's magazines wrote that Zionist invaders are able, with their vast military and their limitless American support, to attack, destroy, and decimate. But in return, they cannot protect themselves from being targeted, from providing safety and security to their people, who now live in an unprecedented state of horror, fear, and panic. And in a sense, that is the classic definition of terrorism. And what Hamas is trying to do is to move the needle. The idea is if they can terrorize the population enough, they can cause the government to change in Israel. This is a flawed concept insofar as Hamas should see that the Israeli government doesn't really care what its people think. It cares about what it as the government wants to do. It doesn't even care what's in the best interest of Israel. It is not in the best interest of Israel to continue to do what it's been doing since 1948. Israel could have gone its own way a long time ago, had a peaceful country, thriving country, and had peace with its neighbors, created a Palestinian state, and just forgotten about all this. But they have to have not only all the land that they want, that they're occupying now, but more land that they haven't occupied yet. That is the direction of the Israeli government. So it's a flawed strategy to say we're going to terrorize the population. That said, they've also missed the opportunity to be ingenious in the way that they go about this so-called terrorism. They could sabotage electrical lines, they could sabotage water, sewage, a lot of other things that would irritate the Israelis enough. And that could be done without killing anybody. And I think that could have the same sort of effect. Not necessarily terrorizing a population, but shall we say inconveniencing a population enough that they would want this to end. And here the author says something great, which is later footnoted, but Israel does not have a Hamas problem, it has a Palestine problem. And this goes back to this issue that's happening now in 2025. Gaza will be fine, but Hamas has to go in this stupid phrase from Israelis, free Palestine, and then they'll add, from Hamas. As if the idea is that Hamas wasn't funded by Israel, that Hamas came out of nowhere. Hamas grew out of the occupation. Hamas wouldn't exist today if the Israelis weren't illegally and immorally occupying the territories. And so when you create Hamas and you help fund Hamas, and then you say, well, gosh, I don't know what's going on with Hamas. Let's pretend tomorrow all of Hamas goes away. Do you think Islamic Jihad is going to go away? Do you think something else isn't going to come up in its place? Why? Because Israel does not have a Hamas problem. It has a Palestine problem. And until the Israelis get that through their rather thick heads, that they're never going to get rid of the Palestinians, so they're going to have to do something about it, something positive, then this is going to continue forever. You can delete the names, you can change the names, but it doesn't matter. What matters is solving the problem. So Israel does not have a Hamas problem, it has a Palestine problem. The West Bank and Gaza were easy to swallow, but difficult to digest. So after, again, The book goes in chronological order, and so as I'm relating some of these facts to you, I may be moving back and forth in history. I hope it isn't too jarring. Despite this rhetoric, the weakened movement did not carry out any attacks as the diplomatic talks between Barak and Arafat restarted. Noting this unusual calm, leaders explained that while the movement's consultative council decided when to escalate or cease fire, Hamas's military wing followed its own tactical considerations, designing and executing operations autonomously and clandestinely. This separation distinguished the visible leaders of Hamas's political wing from the military arm. In this manner, Hamas's politicians engaged in daily politics without compromising the resistance project. Infrequent operations, therefore, did not necessarily indicate a shift in strategy. In an interview in Gaza, Rantisi elaborated, stating that resistance can achieve much without military operations, by safeguarding its fiery routes, foiling the enemy's stability in Palestine, preparing al-Ummah, the Ummah, remember, is the larger Muslim community, which is transnational, to awaken from its slumber and prevent further concessions from the PLO. So remember that during this time, we see the separation where Hamas differentiates itself. The PLO and the PA have proven themselves to be corrupt. I've been told, when in Palestine, by Palestinians, of the corruption of the PA. So it's not a secret. The Palestinians know. And so what happens when you're a corrupt political organization? People look for alternatives. Hamas offered an alternative. Now, it is a tale as old as time that people feel that if I vote for, so if Party A has disappointed me, I will vote for Party B, and Party B has promised that it won't be the same as what Party A does. I'm not saying that dynamic is absent here. I do think that the Palestinians, like everyone in the world, bought into the idea if I vote for someone else, things will be different. I do think that perhaps everyone, including Hamas, was naive to just how much the world, led by the United States, would resist a Hamas-led government. Here we have Sharon's top aide, Dov Weissglass, in an interview several months later. This is after the disengagement from Gaza, so-called disengagement. The disengagement is actually formaldehyde, Weissglass told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. So I've said this in different reviews on the channel in the past that the disengagement was really brilliant from Sharon because it showed and they had a lot of photo ops and they destroyed the settlement. We're willing to give up land, quote unquote, give up land. You occupied that land illegally. This is like a thief giving back a car saying, look, I'm willing to give up this car. Look at how wonderful I am. And then this gave the Israelis the ability to pivot to the West Bank and put all their energy and focus there, because ultimately the West Bank is theologically and in terms of resources and geography much more important to Israel than Gaza is. Gaza doesn't represent the same opportunities that the West Bank does. Now, there is an energy field where there's gas, I think, and oil not far from Gaza, and that is something else as well, but it looks like Israel will take that anyway, without regards to the Palestinians. So remember, nobody cares. Nobody in the world, they can talk, all the countries in the world can talk about how much they care about the Palestinians, but very few actually take any actions. From the outset, Hamas's strength in electioneering and crowd mobilization was distinguishable from the factionalism within Fatah, which had split its candidates into two separate lists. Hamas leveraged its role as the opposition party, capitalizing on the public's frustrations with Fatah and its leader in areas such as corruption, lawlessness, and poor social services. It differentiated itself as a united movement with a strong social infrastructure that had been developed over the course of several decades, and had a reputation for honesty, with highly educated candidates who were able to tackle chronic deficiencies. Furthermore, Hamas portrayed Fatah as being subservient to Israeli and American demands, even when those came at the expense of local needs. Assessing Abbas's tenure, Hamas insisted that he had failed to achieve any of his promises, despite talk of reform and democracy. Lawlessness in Gaza, often by Fatah's own forces, was, for Hamas, proof of Abbas's inability to control the security establishment. His failure to derive the concessions that Israel had outlined in Sharm el-Sheikh, despite the resistance factions adhering to their ceasefire, showed that Abbas remained too weak to influence Israel, And I've said this before in different videos. Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, is one of the greatest disasters to ever happen to Palestine. He's an absolutely dreadful, weak, compromising leader. Moreover, Hamas claimed he had undermined Palestinian successes, such as Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, by acquiescing to Israel's control and movement of goods and people into the Strip. One of the things that is important to chronicle is what we call Professor John Mearsheimer talks about this a lot, and if you don't know about Professor Mearsheimer, you should check out his book, The Israel Lobby. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. He often talks about the escalation ladder, not just in terms of Palestine, but in terms of Iran, Russia, China, that if you keep moving up the escalation ladder, at some point you run into nuclear weapons. And that's why it's always important to keep in mind where you are on the escalation ladder. And Hamas and Israel are quite willing to move up the escalation ladder with each other, at least in the past. And Hamas is the one, here we are in early 2025, Israel is the one that has broken the most recent ceasefire, not Hamas. But that's what Israel does. Routinely, it will make a ceasefire and then it will be the first one to violate it, not Hamas. But you'll never hear that in the Western media. Even though there's proof of that, international humanitarian organizations have verified that, but no, it's all a conspiracy theory. You have to just trust us. Trust me, bro. That is how the Western news media operates. Hamas's offer of a conditional ceasefire led to reduced operations by the movement in the second half of June 2001. Until absolute calm was reinstated, however, Sharon ensured Israel's military grip would not be loosened, as targeted assassinations persisted. On July the 31st, 2001, Israel assassinated 2 Hamas leaders in the West Bank city of Nablus, killing 4 other Hamas members and 2 children in the operation. Describing the Nablus attack as a turning point in Israeli policy, whereby targeted assassinations expanded to include political members, Hamas called on Sharon to assume responsibility for his actions. A week later, on August 9, 2001, Hamas carried out an enormous suicide operation at the Sbarro Pizza in the middle of Jerusalem, killing 15 and injuring more than 90. Hamas's decision to break the calm on its military front and launch this attack was strategic. Primarily, it gauged that its constituents favored retaliatory operations at this time, given the hardship they were enduring under Sharon's military doctrine. The attack was also timed to derail diplomatic initiatives that were beginning to gather pace after the Mitchell Report. The horrific nature of the Sbarro bombing prompted Sharon to mobilize on the same day. The Israeli army attacked the Palestinian security forces in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and invaded the northern West Bank city of Jenin. The operation killed 5 Palestinian officers and injured 31 civilians. By the end of the summer, attrition appeared ongoing. Although Arafat had accepted the Mitchell recommendations, both Hamas and Sharon seemed ready to sustain violence until their counterpart yielded ground. And just within that paragraph, you can see the escalation, then both of the parties climbing up the escalation ladder each time. On June the 10th, just a few days after the Aqaba summit, Israel carried out an assassination attempt on Rantisi in Gaza, once again ensuring that no ceasefire could emerge. Claiming utmost provocation, Al-Qassam called for the mobilization of their cells against all Israeli civilians. The Israeli message has been received and they should await the response, stressed Yassin, while Rantisi issued a statement in which he declared that the term ceasefire no longer exists in Hamas's dictionary. Hamas swiftly executed a suicide attack in Jerusalem on June 11th, so one day following the assassination attempt. The attack not far from the Mahane Yehuda market killed 17 and injured close to 60. The speed and scale of Hamas's retaliation suggested that the movement had indeed been actively restraining earlier attacks as negotiations with the Palestinian Authority proceeded. Because you can't just move a suicide bomber into Israel the next day. That person was already living among the population, or at least in a hideout. And so what provoked them was the Israeli attack. They also underscored Sharon's success in provoking responses from the movement, thereby ensuring no progress could be made on the political front. And remember, Ariel Sharon is a great war criminal. This is the man who was in part responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacres, even recognized by Israel as being responsible for it, was exiled, you could say, politically for some time, has come back, was a great hero of the 1973 war. If you'd like to learn more about the Sabra and Shatila massacres, I've done a video on that. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. But Sharon is the one who started one of the intifadas by walking around the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound with a bunch of thugs to show that Israel can do whatever it wants because that's what we do. And he knew what he was doing. He's very good at provoking. And unfortunately, the Palestinians are very good at falling into this. Nothing requires that you respond to a provocation. And Sharon was very capable of getting that provocation for the Palestinians, usually to his benefit, usually to his political benefit. And that's something that Hamas certainly could have done a better job of managing. On August the 15th, Israel assassinated a leader of Islamic Jihad. 4 days later, in alleged defiance of leaders' commitment to the ceasefire, a renegade Hamas bomber carried out an attack in Jerusalem, killing 23 people and injuring more than 100. Following Hamas's operation, the Israeli army was immediately given instructions to target Hamas's leadership and all its cells in response. A few days later, Israel assassinated Abu Shanab, the force behind Hamas's adherence to the ceasefire. And we saw this in 2024 as well. Israel assassinated the person who was working on ceasefire agreements on behalf of Hamas. So how much can you trust the Israelis? The person who's helping to negotiate for peace, you assassinate him. And that's just, again, you're not going to hear about that from the Western media because poor Israel and poor Israel and poor Israel. But they never want to tell the truth about what Israel actually does. In a press conference following a meeting with Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in Cairo, Tzipi Livni, Israel's foreign minister, stated, in reference to Hamas's rocket fire, "Enough is enough. The situation is going to change." Tzipi Livni, also a horrible person. You can learn more about her and about a lot of these operations. Actually, this is a bit of a preview, but Gaza, an account of its martyrdom by Norm Finkelstein. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. Operation Cast Lead, Protective Edge, Pillar of Defense, all of those things are talked about in this book because they are part of the status quo in Gaza at this moment. But Tzipi Livni, at some point, I think, was actually under some kind of indictment, so that and London said that she couldn't travel there. But she's a horrible person. Sorry, I got distracted by that. Less than 5 days after Zahar's renewed ceasefire offer, on December the 27th, Israel launched the first phase of Operation Cast Lead, an extensive aerial bombing campaign. The operation coincided with the American presidential transition, as President Barack Obama was set to assume office in January 2009, and also preceded Israeli elections. On the opening day of the operation, Israeli fighter planes flew over the Gaza Strip and dropped bombs on a graduation ceremony that Hamas was hosting for its civil police force, killing 99 celebrants and graduates. So when they say, do you support Hamas? You say, do you support people bombing police officers and their families on the day of graduation? Because that's what you're talking about when you're talking about killing Hamas. Police officers are not terrorists. But for people with no sophistication, anybody that opposes Israel is a terrorist, which I suppose makes me one too. Despite anticipating the attack, Hamas was caught off guard by the timing and scale of Israel's offensive. Israel's aerial assault was followed by a ground-air phase that lasted 3 weeks until January the 18th, 2009. During this time, Israel carried out extensive bombing campaigns with hundreds of airstrikes throughout the Gaza Strip. Flying over the most densely populated centers of Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah, Israel targeted buildings, mosques, hospitals, and houses. Military targets. Using the full range of its weaponry, Israel's planes even dropped white phosphorus bombs, a chemical that causes severe burning and is outlawed by international law for use among civilian populations. But as we know, Israel isn't subject to international law because it's special. From the ground, Hamas and other resistance factions maintained rocket fire into towns in southern Israel, launching about 30 missiles per day. Remember that when we're talking about missiles, it's a very generous term to use. I'm looking for what I can use here to give you some sense. I've held an Al-Qassam rocket in my hand before in Stroh when I visited, and I met a family whose house had been hit by the so-called rocket. It's two of these, maybe, together. That is what they call a rocket. When you think of rockets, you might think of actual weapons like what the Israelis have. But what Hamas uses is the equivalent of throwing stones at a tank. It's a way of showing resistance, but the Israelis have an app, they have safe rooms, very not at all. The family I talked to, yeah, we got notice on our app that there were rockets being launched. We went into our safe room and it hit part of their house. So the idea that these are real threats to the Israeli population is an exaggeration of the media, who once again are going to tell you about so-called rocket attacks. But as someone who's actually been to the site of a rocket attack, talked to the Israelis there, I can tell you it isn't at all what you visualize in your mind when you hear rocket attack. Hamas had viewed with trepidation the ensuing proliferation of Salafi presence. Now, Salafi and Wahhabi are not synonymous. One's sort of the subset of another, but it is, you could say, the Islamist wing of Islam. And Hamas they're not part of that world. So Hamas had viewed with trepidation the ensuing proliferation of Salafi presence and worried that kidnappings and lawlessness that had rocked Gaza in 2007 might resume. This was particularly the case given the relative ease of movement through the tunnels between the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. Hamas's security forces swiftly mobilized to capture Arrigoni's 3 murderers. This was, I think, an Italian peace activist that had been killed by one of these people. This was Hamas's security forces swiftly mobilized to capture Arrigoni's 3 murderers, as the government boasted it had clamped down on destabilizing elements to prevent them from terrorizing Gaza. The responsible men, whom Hamas described as belonging to a mentally deviant group, were killed by clashes with Hamas's security forces. Domestic threats coexisted with fears of border instability as skirmishes became more frequent between Israel and Gaza in the spring, threatening to undermine the ceasefire that held in place since Kass led in January 2009. The ceasefire was January 2009. Remember, Kass led happens in 2008. Israel increased its incursions into Gaza and its targetings of Hamas in an effort to stop rockets launched from other groups. Sorry, no, that's not correct about what I said about Kass led. 2009, January 2009. Sorry, forgive my mistake there. Israel increased its incursions into Gaza and its targeting of Hamas in an effort to stop rockets launched from other groups, particularly Islamic Jihad and Salafi jihadists. While noting its right to fire rockets in self-defense, in reality, Hamas again mobilized to contain the factions and prevent the escalation spilling over into a broader conflict. Hamas's attempts to maintain calm highlighted the movement's precarious position of having to pacify the resistance front to mitigate Israeli reprisals, while maintaining the legitimacy of its resistance government. These are two different actions that are difficult to keep together: resistance and negotiations. And after it was elected in the Gaza Strip, Hamas had to try to find that balance, and they're still trying to find that balance. After Kass led, Hamas's role as a de facto government responsible for policing resistance had become more evident than ever, highlighting the manner in which governing responsibilities weighed down the broader movement's ability to sustain armed struggle. There are various agreements that are made during this time period, and you could say they're 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps backward, 1 step forward. They never seem to hold, but they show an evolution in the way that Hamas is thinking about the situation and acting pragmatically. The Cairo Declaration, as it came to be called, was a significant milestone and a declaration that quickly became the cornerstone of Hamas's engagement in the political realm. The declaration affirmed the right of the Palestinian people to resistance in order to end the occupation, establish a Palestinian state with full sovereignty, with Jerusalem as its capital, and the guaranteeing of the right of return of refugees to their homes and property. The Cairo Declaration formalized what Hamas's military disposition throughout the Second Intifada had alluded to, that the movement's immediate political goals were informed by the desire to create a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. Without the ideological concession of recognizing Israel, Hamas had followed in the footsteps of the PLO decades earlier by accepting the notion of Palestinian statehood on a portion of historic Palestine. Perhaps more importantly, in the context of domestic discussions, the Cairo Declaration formalized Hamas's entry into the political arena. The document explicitly stated agreement to develop the PLO on bases that will be settled upon in order to include all the Palestinian powers and factions, as the organization is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Political representation within it was to be based on greater transparency, democratic principles, and pluralism. Agreement on reforming the PLO was a major milestone in Hamas's vision of moving beyond the Palestinian Authority's remit on governance to revive the broader national liberation struggle. The reformed PLO was to be an institution that represented the Palestinian people in their entirety and was committed to their basic national rights to achieve liberation. A cross-factional committee to reform the PLO was created with the understanding that it would work toward the eventual integration of both Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So you can see there are movements among the different Palestinian factions to try to work together. They understand we're never going to do something splintered out into 17, 18, 20, however many groups. We have to work together. Despite immense pressure, particularly from the Obama administration in Israel, who opposed such unilateral actions, Abbas submitted his statehood application. As the president celebrated his grand gesture, Hamas announced its own major success in Gaza. On October the 18th, a month after Abbas's bid, this was a submission for statehood in the United Nations, Hamas completed a prisoner exchange deal with Israel under Egyptian mediation. The agreement, which Hamas called Operation Loyalty of the Free, entailed the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who had been held in captivity for close to 5 years, in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. A hugely disproportionate agreement that underscored the power discrepancy between Israel and the Palestinians. And ironically, this also fits with the Israeli narrative. They say, one Israeli fingernail is not worth, a million dead Arabs. So here they showed that they really believed that. They exchanged one Israeli for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. Amazing job by Hamas there. Having refused to link negotiations for Shalit's release with ceasefire talks at a staggering cost to Gaza, Hamas was ultimately vindicated. Its ability to hold on to Shalit, despite Israel's attempts to free him, and despite the known network of collaborators within Gaza, was described as legendary. With this diplomatic coup, Hamas rejoiced in its role as a powerful counterpart to Israel, and as a Palestinian government that was able to effect real change on the ground. As Mashal noted, we are now experts in the Israeli mentality because God has shown us who they are, while he suggested that other Palestinian negotiators take note. At the time of this writing in 2017, Israel remains opposed to the reintegration of the Palestinian territories, as of this writing, forever! Ostensibly to avoid Hamas's ability to influence the stability of the West Bank and undermine the security coordination that had been instituted between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Israel has also, however, benefited from Hamas's entrapment in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas has proven extremely adept at managing the various factions that remain committed to resistance against Israel. Since 2007, Hamas has proven both willing and able to enter into and sustain ceasefires with Israel. Equally importantly, Hamas has been successful at stabilizing the coastal enclave. This territory had always presented an exceptional challenge for Israel, even though it forms only 1.3% of the land of historic Palestine. This is primarily due to its population density, which threatens to offset Israel's Jewish majority if placed under direct Israeli control, a formula that was a key driver in Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's decision to disengage from the Strip. Gaza also contains a high proportion of Palestinian refugees who had settled there after fleeing or being driven out of their homes in 1948. This population mix has meant that Gaza has consistently been a foundation of resistance to Zionism and to Israel's ongoing military rule over Palestinians. Gaza's defiant spirit, as this book has suggested, builds on a decades-old history. It did not begin with Hamas, and neither did Israel's lethal disposition toward the small strip of land. Since 1948, Israel has waged more than 12 wars on Gaza, reoccupied the territory, isolated its inhabitants, placed the enclave under siege, and unilaterally disengaged in attempts to rid itself of the challenge it presents. In the 1950s, decades before Hamas's creation, Israel designated Gaza a Fedayeen's nest, a territory that merited constant isolation and military bombardment to break the resistance. How's that been working out, Israel? In the late 1980s, with the eruption of the First Intifada, Israel began restricting the mobility of Palestinians from Gaza into Israel through the use of a complex permit system. This evolved into the general adoption of closure tactics throughout the 1990s as Gaza was repeatedly placed under blockade. In 1995, an electric fence separating Gaza from the rest of the territories was constructed. None of these policies, and no combination of them, managed to pacify the Gaza Strip. It is no surprise that Gaza has made its way into Israeli contemporary vernacular, whereby the phrase "go to Gaza" is now the popular manner of saying "go to hell." I first learned this in Amira Haas's Drinking the Sea at Gaza. If you'd like to learn more about that book, I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. Israel's intermittent closures evolved into a permanent and impermeable blockade after Hamas's takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007. Hamas's very existence appeared to offer Israel the opportunity to formalize these various means of severing Gaza from the rest of Palestine, both discursively and practically. Under Hamas's rule, Gaza moved from being a fedayeen's nest to becoming a hostile entity and an enclave of terrorism. Israeli leaders consistently present Hamas as nothing more than an irrational and bloodthirsty actor seeking Israel's destruction. This framing is part of a longer history of sidestepping the political concerns that animate Palestinian nationalism by labeling movements such as Hamas and the PLO as terrorist organizations. I repeat, Israel does not have a Hamas problem. They have a Palestine problem. In Hamas's case, its Islamic nature facilitates a greater conflation of its actions with groups such as Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State. If you're enjoying this content so far, I could say you enjoy reading about the oppression of the Palestinians or hearing about it. But if you're enjoying what I'm doing so far, please consider hitting like, subscribe, sharing this with someone who is open-minded enough to hear about what's really going on in Palestine. A note about the book itself, it is a rather dry, newspapery account in chronological order. And someone like myself who is focused on learning a lot about what is happening in Palestine, I have an interest in reading it. So I think it was easier for me, but I think among books that I would generally recommend, I would have to put some caution that it's not a compelling page turner. It is a slog, lots of really helpful endnotes and incredible bibliography, but it may not be the easiest read. Thankfully, it's not very long. So even if it's not an easy read in terms of it being a bit more plodding and slow, it will still be, I think, very, very enlightening if you wish to know what is going on with Hamas. Whether inadvertently or cynically, Hamas is often described as the local manifestation of global terror networks. The fact that the word terrorism can accommodate both Al-Qaeda and Hamas marks the scale of its imprecision and failure to communicate valuable information about political violence. While Al-Qaeda is part of a transnational network that wages a global violent struggle against Western hegemony, Hamas adopts armed resistance on a localized front to end an occupation that is deemed illegal by international law. More importantly, unlike networks such as Al-Qaeda, Hamas has not rejected democratic politics or implemented a repressive Salafi regime in Gaza. It has also openly clashed with the local manifestations of these transnational networks. Hamas neither espouses an ideology of global terror, nor does it seek to create a transnational Islamic caliphate. It is a movement that utilizes Islamic discourse to deal with contemporary ailments, and that is geographically tethered to the specific political and social environment of the occupation. So people like to conflate Hamas with Al-Qaeda, and it just shows you they have no idea what they're talking about. And when someone says that, just ask, can you explain to me a little bit about Al-Qaeda and its origins and a little bit about Hamas and its origins? They'll be unlikely to do either. But once you've got them to do that, you've got them to say, I don't have to listen to anything else you have to say because you just made a statement that you're not even able to back up. In a historic watershed that marked the culmination of its politicization, Hamas won 76 of the 132 seats of the Legislative Council relative to Fatah's 43. Proclamations of tsunami, earthquake, coup peppered the movement's publications, given the unexpected scale of the victory. Hamas immediately dismissed the notion that this outcome was simply a protest vote against Fatah's corruption. As a senior leader in Beirut stated, "This is a peaceful coup on the present decrepit political reality, which was born out of defeat, corruption, and acquiescence to rotten political solutions. These results are an excellent political renewal, as if the Palestinian people are reborn, and it's a new birth for the project of resistance, for the development of a society of resistance, for a shaking off of all the institutions." Reaffirming this renewal, Abu Marzouk said, "We will not be in the politics of free concessions. What was before January the 25th, 2006 will be different from what comes after in terms of the mechanisms for engaging with the Zionist enemy, because that old manner of dealing with the enemy did not produce any gains on the ground. It produced castles in the clouds." Hamas looked forward to a different form of politics. Instead of settlement and negotiations, came a program of change, reform, and resistance. Through its election, Hamas had found a way to transition the goals that had animated its armed struggle during the Second Intifada into the political arena. An inadvertent revolution had propelled the movement into a leading position within the Palestinian struggle for liberation. By early 2006, Hamas had built a solid foundation from which to intervene in the broader quest for national self-determination and bring its uncompromising vision of Islamic Palestinian nationalism into the heart of Palestinian political institutions. So, how did the civilized world react? The American approach was rooted in the belief that Palestinians had voted for change, seeking a less corrupt government than Fatah's, but that they still desired a negotiated peace settlement in the form of a two-state solution, unlike Hamas. In reality, Palestinians had voted Hamas in for a number of reasons, including frustration with Fatah's corruption, resentment at the failed and endless peace talks, Hamas's reliability in providing welfare services, and indeed its defiant rhetoric against the occupation. Support of armed struggle or Hamas's Islamic ideology did not feature prominently in its electoral platform or constitute the majority of its votes, which is why you'll see a majority of Christians, Palestinian Christians, also voted for Hamas. Nonetheless, Hamas's leaders interpreted the movement's victory as a resounding endorsement of its worldview, not simply an affirmation of its clean governance and its strong social and charitable institutions. President Mahmoud Abbas and the European members of the Quartet initially viewed Hamas's inclusion in the political system as a development that could offer diplomatic opportunities or moderate the movement. In contrast, convinced it could reverse the election results, the Bush administration decided to focus on its support of President Abbas and began a secretive train and equip program aimed at bolstering Fatah's arms and capabilities. And this underscores the idea that the lie that America is the great defender of freedom and democracy. You can see here there was a Democratic vote presided over by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter. It was noted as one of the most free and fair elections in the history of the world, actually, and the first in the Arab world. And America's response is, we're going to arm the opposition and hope for a military coup. That's how America deals with things. They cannot, like the Israelis, that's why I think the Israelis and the Americans get along so well. When they can't make their argument at the table peacefully, they make their argument with guns and weapons because it has to be their way. They can't see that their failure to persuade is a failure of their argument. It has to be their way. And so if you dare to vote for somebody who isn't what we consider to be acceptable, we're going to make sure you get killed. This initiative raised worries within some corners of the American establishment that weapons might ultimately fall into the wrong hands and be used against Israel. But the administration pushed forward. To circumvent congressional obstacles against arming Palestinians, the United States leveraged networks in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to fund the arms that were then delivered to Fatah through Egypt and Jordan. In the first days after its victory in early 2006, Hamas appeared unperturbed in the face of this international mobilization. It stressed that the people's choice had to be respected if an Algerian-style revolution was to be avoided. Publications declared that the international community had to respect the will of the Palestinian people given its habit of preaching the virtues of democracy. Anxiety that a so-called terrorist organization had been democratically elected was seen by Hamas as proof that the prevalent paradigm through which the Palestinian struggle was perceived in the West was flawed. For Hamas and its supporters, their actions constituted armed resistance against a terroristic occupation. Certain that the movement could circumvent the blockade, Hamas's leader Khaled Mashal remarked, "If the door to the west is shut, then the doors to the Arab and Islamic East must remain open." Hamas's stance made clear that explicit ideological revisions would not be forthcoming before ironclad assurances that its demands would be met. Hamas leaders noted in private that they were willing to put these offers forward in full confidence, knowing that Israel would never accept a Palestinian state on 1967. Hamas's gamble paid off in the sense that its bluff was never called. The movement's repeated invocations of its willingness to accept the 1967 borders for a future Palestinian state. Again, I'm going to list all of these things, and these are all no-goes for Israel. So, willingness to accept the 1967 borders for a future Palestinian state? No. With East Jerusalem as its capital? No. Were constantly ignored by Israel. They also fell short of expectations within the Bush administration of what Palestinian concessions needed to be. American officials involved in the peace process believed behind closed doors that in pursuit of the two-state solution, Israel would retain its major settlement blocks and the right of return would not be implemented. These are two more issues. The settlement blocks obviously have to be evacuated, or if they stay, they're going to be part of a Palestinian state. And the right of return will not be implemented. If there is no right of return, then the UN's a joke. In the accepted wisdom of the peace process, this was viewed as a starting point for negotiations, rather than the mutual Israeli-Palestinian recognition of the 1967 borders as a basis for negotiating land swaps. While accepting the 1967 line was a major concession for Hamas, the Israeli government had itself not shown interest in preserving the 1967 line, but had rather deliberately blurred the border by continuing massive settlement expansion to ensure the irrelevance of the Green Line and any future negotiations, and that's the whole point of the border wall. The border wall is built in and around the Green Line, stealing Palestinian land. This underscored Hamas's sense that the PLO's blind and subservient dedication to negotiations had ensured that the demands Palestinians needed to meet kept shifting, while Israel sustained its colonization of Palestinian land. Instead, Mashal and other Hamas leaders developed a defiant negotiating position. "Why do we self-flagellate?" he went on to say during his tour. "Why do we take on the responsibility of a situation or a reality when everyone is convinced that what has brought us here is Zionist intransigence, American bias, and the inability of the world to push back on Israel and obligate it with the rights of Palestinians?" Hamas's thinking was grounded in a revolutionary's mindset, questioning why past policies enacted by the PLO had to persist in light of the most recent democratic election. Perhaps more importantly, leaders argued that the agreements were redundant given Israel's chronic failure to meet its own responsibility. How can you honor an agreement when Israel hasn't completed the other side of the agreement? Clearly, the agreements are null and void. Mashal responded to persistent calls from Abbas to accept past agreements. "There is proof that Israel does not care for the Palestinian people, does not recognize their rights, and does not abide by any agreement signed with them. Moreover, it does not even consider Mahmoud Abbas nor Yasser Arafat as Palestinian partners. Where is the benefit for the people to tie themselves in agreements that time has annulled?" By the end of May, the quartet admitted that its policies were impacting the entire population of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, and recognized that this could cause a humanitarian disaster. Even the disappointing Arab pledges were failing to reach Hamas's government as the Arab League avoided banks that could be persecuted under American anti-terrorism laws. Hamas grew increasingly resentful of the Zionist offensive carried out with American support and Arab complicity. In an interview with Mashal, Hamas's leader suddenly called the blockade political blackmail and insisted that if Arab nations had the political will to break it, they would have found a way to transfer their pledges. Hamas's leaders were explicitly bitter that even after Hamas's having made significant concessions in accepting the formation of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, members of the international community still strive to isolate the movement and defeat its political ambitions. Hamas's leaders were also particularly resentful about what they perceived as support for the blockade from Fatah. While the movement claimed it had raised a total of $500 million worth of pledges from its tours, which would cover it for 3 months, wire transfers were impossible. Hamas's leaders attempted to circumvent this by carrying briefcases of money across the Rafah border between Egypt and Gaza, prompting Abbas to call for legal action against the smugglers. Hamas's publication portrayed the president as working with the United States and Israel to starve the people into submission, while Hamas was smuggling money in to feed them by standing firm against American diktats. And that is part of why you see so much support for Hamas even after the greatest attack on Gaza in its history, what we witnessed between October of 2023 to January of 2025. Gaza has never been under that kind of attack in all of its history. And yet, what happens after the ceasefire? Hamas is still in power, and those people march to the north in this inspiring photograph. And why is that? Well, because Hamas did its best during all of these times, not just the most recent time, but in 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012, 2014, to try to get as many people fed as they could. This isn't to say that Hamas didn't suffer from its own corruption. Most organizations do, and the book is good about pointing this out. However, the reason that Gaza is still loyal to Hamas is because Hamas has stood by them through all of these actions of Israel. The government also worked to control radical Salafi jihadists, such as smaller offshoots of al-Qaeda and other transnational terror movements that resided in Gaza. The movement's leaders reiterated that there was no major institutional presence of Salafi jihadists, but rather a number of individuals who were susceptible to such ideologies. Hamas adopted a consultative approach coupled with an iron fist when dealing with these groups, hosting sessions aimed at discussing and debunking the Salafi interpretation of Islam as a way to reverse their ideological conviction through diplomacy. The success of this approach was made evident early on through Hamas's role in negotiating the release of Alan Johnson, a BBC reporter held hostage by Jaish al-Islam, the Islamic Army, a Salafist movement in Gaza. Hamas's opposition to any form of transnational terroristic ideologies was concretized by its decision not to implement Sharia law in Gaza after its takeover, choosing instead to uphold conservative social values and the slow, organic Islamization of the Strip. This goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this review, is that Hamas's idea is to create a strong sense of virtue and religion within the people, tied together with resistance, and to find a way to link the religion and the not to link the religion, but to link the virtues of the religion to the resistance. So instead of imposing Sharia law, which it didn't do, it wanted to encourage people to chase virtue, which any civilization would be encouraged to do. Despite this focus on internal sustenance, household income dropped sharply and dependence on food aid expanded. The desperate situation led to, and was ultimately mitigated by, a rapid shift toward a tunnel-based economy. Tunnels between the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt and the Gaza Strip, passing underneath the Rafah border, had historically been used for smuggling contraband and resistance weapons, particularly during the Second Intifada. After Israel's disengagement from Gaza, and as policies aimed at isolating Hamas gathered force, the economic value of the tunnels increased even before the movement's electoral victory. With the blockade and the absence of any official trade channels, tunnels became Gaza's economic lifeline. From 20 tunnels in mid-2007, the number began expanding soon after Hamas's takeover, as all basic supplies and goods, as well as weapons, were transported into the Gaza Strip via tunnels. As Hamas oversaw a concerted drive to expand the tunnel infrastructure in Egypt, it began creating a shadow subterranean economy that benefited Hamas's ruling class rather than the traditional mercantile sector within Gaza. So at some point, I think we were talking about 500 tunnels, unbelievable number of tunnels, which helped keep the Palestinian people alive in Gaza. So I'm very grateful for those tunnels and for the young men who dug them. The reason for Hamas's ability to mitigate the blockade was primarily the tunnel economy. Gradual expansion since Israel's disengagement accelerated significantly after Hamas took over the Strip, such that by the summer of 2008, there were more than 500 tunnels snaking beneath the Rafah border, bringing in a monthly revenue of about $36 million to Hamas. The tunnel business became a sprawling enterprise of operators and merchants that was legalized by Hamas's government, which established an authority in the southern Gazan municipality of Rafah to regulate the tunnel trade. The Rafah municipality also allowed Hamas to control the entry of weapons into the Strip. Hamas's self-assurance belied a level of diplomatic hardening as well as confidence in its military capacity. Discussing an anticipated Israeli attack, a senior leader in Hamas's external branch noted that the movement was ready, as Gaza 2008 was not Gaza 2005. Such posturing, however, rang hollow, as Hamas maintained a firm grip on rockets from Gaza, indicating a desire to avoid any conflagration with Israel. Despite the near absence of rocket fire, Israel maintained a tight ban on entry or export of goods from Gaza and a total ban on the movement of people. As domestic Palestinian talks faltered in late 2008, so did the ceasefire agreement with Israel. On November the 4th, in a dramatic escalation, Israel broke the ceasefire by raiding the Gaza Strip, citing preemptive self-defense against an attack tunnel that Hamas was allegedly building to capture Israeli soldiers. Hamas denied these accusations, noting that its tunnels were being built for defensive or economic purposes. It responded with a barrage of rockets over the border. This skirmish, although brief, demonstrated Israel's desire to end the ceasefire, as Hamas had anticipated. For its part, the movement sought the opportunity to renegotiate the terms of the agreement. Israel had not only failed to sufficiently relax the blockade, a key condition of the truce, but had evidently continued its incursions into Gaza. This was even though Hamas had been remarkably effective, as Israeli security officials openly admitted, in enforcing the truce from the Gazan front. So even when they do what they're supposed to do, Israel still finds ways to break the ceasefire. Again, you will not hear about this in the mainstream news. After 5 years of governance, Hamas regarded reconciliation as a process of working alongside the West Bank government to reconstitute and resuscitate the PLO, and to reconcile the two conflicting liberation strategies, negotiations or resistance, rather than seeking unity within the structures of the Palestinian Authority. This stance proved that despite the hardships of the blockade, and given the tunnel economy in Gaza, Hamas was not sufficiently pressured into submission. Hamas's stance undermined the political rationale of the blockade and underscored that its only impact was the collective punishment of ordinary Palestinians living in Gaza. Prospects for reconciliation remained slim, as neither party exhibited a willingness to compromise on what each viewed as the optimal national trajectory, or to make the concessions for sustainable unity. Mishal reported that reconciliation was further off than ever before. Yet neither faction could be publicly seen as obstructing reconciliation, giving fears of a popular backlash. Further, unofficial mediation by civil society and the private sector was prevalent. But these initiatives were not promising. According to one of Hamas's representatives present at the meetings, Abbas has unfortunately demeaned the issue of Palestinian reconciliation to the formation of a technocratic government and the setting of a date for the presidential and legislative elections, as if nothing happened, as if there is no political and institutional conflict within the Palestinian arena. I've been studying a lot of false flags over on my main Stephen Heiner channel, and when I read this, I thought for sure this was another example of a false flag, because there is no reason that Hamas would have pulled this off. As Mishal toured the region on August the 5th, a brutal attack by unknown assailants on the Rafah border killed 16 Egyptian soldiers. Although the assailants were widely assumed to be Salafi jihadists, or Israel Special Forces, Hamas and the Gaza Strip inevitably got caught in the crossfire. Hamas condemned this crime in strong terms, yet almost immediately Egyptian media pointed to Gaza as the location from which the perpetrators had originated, despite Hamas's strong denunciation of such rumors. Reacting to the mass uproar in Egypt, Morsi promptly sealed the Rafah borders and closed the tunnels, sharply overturning Hamas's hope for greater openness between Egypt and Gaza under his presidency. Hamas's government deployed heavy military around the tunnels from the Gazan side to prevent anyone entering. The government also reached out to the factions in Gaza and declared that it saw no proof of involvement from anyone in the Strip. Clearly alluding to Salafi jihadists, both Hamas and Islamic Jihad stressed that the resistance factions refused to serve as a protective cloak for movements that were ideologically deviant. This is in reaction to Operation Protective Edge. Gazans hypothesized that the brutality of the offensive was a tactic to force them to turn against Hamas. In many instances this worked, particularly when Hamas showed its own merciless face. Under the heavy toll of bombing, Hamas used the chaotic environment of war to settle its own political scores and carry out extrajudicial assassinations of its domestic enemies, including members of Fatah who were held in its jails, as well as suspected collaborators or informants for Israel. More disturbingly, in the early days of Operation Protective Edge, Hamas's Ministry of Interior called on citizens not to respond to evacuation orders by the Israeli army, asserting that these were only issued as a form of psychological warfare to create panic. Many in Gaza criticized Hamas, not least for its role in dragging the coastal enclave into another conflagration. Others were critical of Hamas's governance record and its authoritarian streak. Nonetheless, the sense of duty and support for resistance in the face of Israel's onslaught was a powerful force, one that led to greater solidarity around the notion of resistance against Israel's violence. While during previous operations popular support for Gaza brought people to the streets around the Arab world, protests were relatively sparse during Protective Edge, as the Middle East was engaged in numerous hot wars. Criticizing the inadequate Arab response, a leader in Gaza noted that Hamas defends the Ummah's honor with self-made weapons, while all the weapons piling up in the storage warehouses of the Arab armies are rusting, and if they're ever used, they're used against their own people. This is true. So now we are at the conclusion of the author, and this will be a rather long section that I'm going to read, but I feel it deserves to be read as a whole. Apart from its Islamic nature, two other factors have undergirded Hamas's ideological strength. The first is the failed precedent of the PLO. Like Hamas, the PLO was ostracized until it accepted formulaic conditions that had been dictated by the United States, the renunciation of armed struggle, and the recognition of Israel. The PLO believed, rightly, that ideological concessions would allow it to negotiate with Israel. It also imagined, mistakenly, that diplomacy would lead to Palestinian statehood. Hamas has learned this lesson and is unlikely to concede on any of its core ideological tenets without guarantees that such compromises would lead to the fulfillment of Palestinian rights. In Hamas's view, the PLO's concessions were its ticket into the corridors of diplomacy at the cost of its legitimacy. Far from securing Palestinian rights, these concessions have weakened the Palestinian struggle and entrenched the Israeli occupation to previously unimaginable levels. The second factor is that Hamas has what it sees as two resounding victories that justify armed struggle. Israel's withdrawals from South Lebanon in 2000 and from the Gaza Strip in 2005 were both unilateral Israeli measures taken after years of armed resistance in each of these locales. Rather than the byproduct of diplomacy or negotiations, these instances of liberation are perceived by Hamas as the vindication of resistance, because force is the only language that Israel understands. It doesn't understand the language of diplomacy, and it doesn't understand the language of international law. Force is all that Israel recognizes, and that's why Hamas is right in resisting them. While remaining ideologically inflexible, Hamas has offered pragmatic concessions when dealing with the three conditions imposed by the international community: renounce violence, recognize Israel, and accept past agreements. As various chapters in this book demonstrate, Hamas has issued repeated offers to end its violence in return for Israeli reciprocity. Throughout the years of the Second Intifada and afterward, Hamas intermittently held fire unilaterally in the face of rapid Israeli militarization. Israel has consistently ignored these overtures. Even after its takeover of the Gaza Strip, Hamas became increasingly effective at policing Gaza's borders. Yet calm interludes were systematically ignored by Israel, which maintained its violent chokehold and incursions into the Strip. Hamas also made great strides with regard to accepting past agreements, offering to abide by whatever outcome a reformed and representative PLO puts forward. This concession has been made even as successive Israeli governments have themselves failed to respect or uphold past agreements. By 2007, when Hamas accepted the Mecca Agreement, the movement declared its willingness to respect international agreements and defer to the PLO in negotiations with Israel. These political concessions have consistently been deemed insufficient. The issue that has proven most intractable is Hamas's refusal to recognize Israel. In many ways, this is the backbone of Hamas's ideology. It is both the final trump card before reaching a settlement and the last line that must be defended to safeguard the imagined purity of Palestinian nationalism. For decades, Hamas has explicitly and repeatedly indicated its willingness to accept the creation of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, most recently by issuing a revised political manifesto in 2017. Even prior to its election victory in 2006, Hamas consistently explained that its use of armed struggle was limited to forcing Israel to end its occupation rather than the destruction of the state as a whole. Hamas's leaders believe this would offer a peaceful settlement between Israel and the Palestinians and end the bloodshed. Israel is convinced this would be a temporary solution before Hamas rearms and attacks from a strengthened position, which it may do. While Hamas may indeed continue to harbor ideological aspirations for the liberation of the entirety of Palestine after such a peaceful settlement, the likelihood that the movement would have popular backing for such a step is likely to be non-existent if a just settlement is offered. And I believe that to be true, that if they did accept, and again, this is a science fiction universe in which Israel accepts a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders and Hamas accepts, that once that state is established and people have peace, there is not going to be a lot of support within that new Palestinian country for a militant Hamas. I don't see how that would be the case. Khaled Mishal has even offered written guarantees to international mediators underscoring this, noting that Hamas would abide by the outcome of any referendum to a peace deal delivered to the Palestinian people, including deals that entail mutual recognition, while stressing that Hamas would not accept those outcomes until the deal is implemented, unlike what the PLO did with Oslo. It is more likely the case that Hamas is simply maintaining this ideological intransigence as a negotiating tactic and a matter of principle, tying into the movement's legitimacy and its effectiveness as an interlocutor. The movement believes that conceding the remaining cards that Hamas still clings to would ensure that Palestinian rights continue to be forfeited, as had happened following the PLO's recognition of Israel. As one leader explained, why should we be forced to explicitly recognize Israel if we've already indicated we have a de facto acceptance of its presence? Hamas's implicit acceptance of Israel has gone far beyond what many Israeli political parties, including the dominant ruling Likud party, have offered Palestinians within their charters. With their refusal to recognize the right of Palestinian self-determination, their insistence that the Palestinian people never existed, and the intermittent resurfacing of the, quote, Jordan option. If you want to hear more about that, it's at the very conclusion of the book One State, Two States by Benny Morris, which I've reviewed before. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. Several Israeli political parties have long opposed the notion of a Palestinian state. In 2013, Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly reneged on his highly touted 2009 Bar Ilan speech in which he spoke of the possibility of a demilitarized Palestinian state. Hamas leaders consistently reaffirmed how their acceptance of the 1967 line is a negotiating tactic made in the full conviction that Israel itself refuses to acknowledge the legitimacy of this border. Israel's refusal to countenance Hamas's repeated offers around the 1967 line reaffirmed this conviction. Israel's demand for Hamas's ideological concession prior to any form of diplomatic engagement is likely to remain futile. The PLO's experience shows that Israel has hardly acted as a benevolent occupier. If Hamas were to shift its own policies and accept the quartet's conditions, it would lose valuable political capital and negotiating clout. Hamas has long called on Palestinian diplomats to hold on to their trump cards rather than negotiate in good faith. Should Israel ever choose to pursue a peace option or itself accept the legitimacy of the 1967 borders, admittedly an unlikely development given the current political climate in Israel, Hamas would present a powerful and effective counterpart. Yet rather than empowering its negotiating partners, Israel has historically pursued a self-fulfilling prophecy that ensures there is no partner by weakening its counterparts and undermining their legitimacy, and might I add, murdering the leadership of the people that there's no partners. In essence, Hamas's takeover of Gaza marked the failure of Israel's efforts to centralize Palestinian decision-making, with compliant figures like Mahmoud Abbas, who in effect allow Israel to maintain its occupation cost-free. And the author concludes by saying that it was a political mistake for Hamas to enter the system. Hamas's entry into the political system was threatening to actors invested in maintaining the status quo. Nonetheless, Hamas failed to understand the balance that had to be struck between government and revolution. It had mistakenly assumed that revolution could be launched from within the very systems that had been created to domesticate the national struggle. Transitioning into the political system in many ways mired the movement and compromised its liberation agenda in its effort to reconstitute the incumbent order. So I see an analogy here between what happened to Hamas and what is currently happening with the MAGA movement in the United States, that the people elected to the government in America are trying to attack the government itself. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm not interested in commenting on in this review, but it is analogous to what was happening here. Hamas didn't really believe in the structures of the PLO. They felt that they'd been compromised because of Oslo, but they still went into the legislative elections to get themselves elected and then wanted to go back against what the Palestinian Authority stood for since Oslo. It's an interesting gambit. You don't believe in the structures, but you get yourself elected into the structures to then dismantle the structures. That's the same movement that MAGA is pursuing in the United States at the moment. They got themselves elected, and now they are trying to dismantle sections of the government. Whether that's legitimate, whether they'll be successful, time will tell. The idea that the author could write a book in 2018 saying Hamas contained should show you that making conclusions about something so short as a period of 10 to 12 years and saying Hamas contained the pacification of Palestinian resistance following this tremendous strategic victory of Hamas over Israel in this most recent 2023 to 2025 period should show you don't make your predictions too soon. Excellent book. If you'd like to learn more about Hamas, one way you can support this channel is by buying it via the link in the description below. You can also, for free, hit like, subscribe, share this with people who have been subject to the silly question, do you support Hamas, by people who don't know what Hamas is. So send them a copy of this review and ask them to take a look at it, maybe discuss it among yourselves. If you'd like to thank me for this review, there's a link to Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal below. These are ways that you can support the channel. If you'd like to support my work on an ongoing basis, get access to early reviews like this one, early access to reviews like this one, as well as private videos that aren't available to the public and discussions with me behind the scenes about my book selection process, you'll find my Patreon and YouTube membership links below. Also, if you'd like to nominate a book for the future, you'll find my Amazon wish list if my book is on there. And obviously, I also share that wish list with my Stephen Heiner main channel, so you'll see non-Palestinian books there. Just keep in mind, if you're picking a book from there, obviously for this channel, pick a Palestinian book. For the other channel, pick a non-Palestinian book. Nominate the book. In that way, you can, in a way, sponsor the video. A reminder that the profits from all of these different means go to the profits from that go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, and as part of our current race to monetize the channel. Once we monetize the channel, the expenses that I'm currently incurring can be offset, and the remainder can then go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. There's a link to them in the description. Please go there, check out their work. They're amazing. You can support them directly yourself, or consider supporting them indirectly by supporting our work. Until next time, enjoy your reading.